Welcome to Urban X Real Talk Fitness Radio News. You know, I really resisted the impulse to do a show about the coronavirus because I didn't want to contribute or feed into in any way the ongoing mass hysteria over a contagion that is largely no more portentous or lethal than the common flu. Nonetheless, my philosophy has always been about empowerment, and the best system I can think of to empower someone, anyone, is through their usage of increased knowledge. So today, I want to share with you some basic facts about viruses themselves and then provide a little historical background for context relative to today's narrative about this virus. First of all, human coronaviruses have been around for a lot longer than you and I. In fact, if you look at the back of a Lysol bottle, one of the bullet points is that it kills cold and flu viruses, including influenza A2 and human coronavirus. And Lysol has been around since I can remember. Now, having said that, here are some basic facts about viruses that you may or may not know. Viruses are microscopic parasites. Yes, they are parasitic in nature, and they are generally much smaller than bacteria, about 10,000 times smaller than a grain of salt. They also lack the capacity to thrive and reproduce outside of a host cell. So remember, polio is a virus. Hepatitis is a virus. Measles is a virus. So what's my point? My point is to simply inform you that viruses take on many forms and levels of severity. Viruses teeter on the boundaries of what is considered life itself. On the one hand, they contain the key elements that make up all living organisms, the nucleic acids, DNA or RNA. However, it should be noted that in any given virus, they can only express one or the other, meaning DNA or RNA. On the other hand, viruses lack the capacity to independently read and act upon the information contained within these nucleic acids. Thus, the primary role of the virus is to deliver its DNA or RNA genome into the host cell so that its genome can be expressed. That is transcribed or translated by the host cell. Now remember, viruses, like all living organisms, want to live, just as you and me. In order to accomplish this, however, viruses must attach themselves to host cell surfaces. They do so by recognizing and binding to cell surface receptors, like two interlocking puzzle pieces. Many different viruses can bind to the same receptor, and a single virus can bind different cell receptors. While viruses use cell surface receptors to their advantage, cell receptors are designed to serve the cell, not some clone, version, imposter, or foreign agent, which a virus is. Now, in a nutshell, here's what all the major concern and hysteria is about. Viruses can be spread airborne. In fact, one sneeze can emit 20,000 droplets containing rhinovirus or coronavirus in this case. Touching or breathing these droplets is all it takes for a virus to spread. Now, once entering the body, it can remain in the throat for 4 to 5 hours. There are many modes of entry for a virus, but in the case of influenza-type viruses, what makes it unique is the fact that it is surrounded by a protein envelope, which is then engulfed by the cell. Now that's its claim to distinction. No way am I trying to minimize its potential severity, especially given the fact that this virus can survive in the air for several hours. Indeed, that fact alone makes COVID-19, at least hypothetically, a serious threat because we are fast approaching allergy season. So many people will be more susceptible to nasal irritants like pollen and grass, which also means they will likely sneeze more. I've even heard officials from the World Health Organization warning the public that COVID-19 is 10 times more infectious than the common flu. But when you consider that the so-called common flu has an incidence rate of 0.01, then it puts things in perspective when assessing coronavirus, which has an incidence of 1%. Indeed, that is 10 times higher, but we're still talking just 1%. The question remains, is the public overreacting to COVID-19? And if so, why? Take a deep breath and ask yourself, is there some reason for such widespread panic? And if there is, who's driving this narrative and why? By now, I would think the narrative would have changed to prevention, more so than the doomsday narratives being repeated and reported nearly every day. Yet, interestingly enough, something happened in America at the turn of the 20th century you might not be aware of that might offer some fresh perspective to what seems like a historic, unprecedented event. Believe me, it's not. In fact, all you have to do is just think back a few years. Remember in 2003, media spread fear-mongering about SARS, and it proved to be way overblown with only 800 deaths reported after the hysteria subsided. And SARS had a mortality incidence rate of 3%. In 2009, the World Health Organization also falsely predicted a global swine flu pandemic, H1N1, that would impact over 2 billion over the next 2 years. Well, that too never happened. Now, some might remember that at the time, there was a widely held belief that H1N1 was bioengineered in a U.S. laboratory and that even the vaccines for it were extremely hazardous and potentially lethal. But there was no national or global emergency. There was no pandemic or epidemic because no pandemic or epidemic actually occurred. In fact, the CDC estimated that from 8,500 to 17,000 deaths resulted from the strain. Now again, I'm not trying to minimize or marginalize or even trivialize death. I would never do that. However, to put those numbers in perspective, 19,000 deaths occurred from the flu last year in 2019. So let me quickly provide you a portrait of an epidemic that genuinely was devastating. In 1918, a common plague assaulted the world with the fury of a heavyweight southpaw's roundhouse to the face. Its greatest power was the element of surprise. Not that the worldwide scientific community was completely unsuspecting. It wasn't. Indeed, the greatest scientific minds of that day simply decided to ignore, almost with an incredible lack of inquisitiveness, the imminent plague and instead discredit its potential severity as if it were just another seasonal varietal of the flu. Well, it wasn't. False claims of victory over the infestation even made headline news. But by the end of the epidemic, nearly 20 million people lost their lives in the U.S. alone. So what, if anything, did we learn from this almost inconceivable worldwide pandemic? Why couldn't the medical establishment of that day predict, let alone recognize the astounding arc of the disease? After all, its victim arc resembled a W in that it killed children and teenagers and 20-somethings with the same consistency and veracity that claimed its elderly victims. Besides HIV, there may not have ever been an affliction that compares to influenza 1918's devastation on American soil. Complete families and communities were decimated, and despite the too little too late efforts of the Wilson-led administration, the entire economy was completely obliterated. One of the major reasons the flu of 1918 was so elusive was the fact that it had visited America only months before during that fall, masking as a normal flu, which meant its victims suffered from the usual chills, mild fever, achiness, which lasted for about 3 days before returning to their normal lucidity. Yet when the disease returned that summer, it was completely different. Something happened between that fall and summer that transformed it from a mildly infectious flu to a deadly disease. What did the medical establishment of that day miss? And is it possible we are missing similar telltale signs with COVID-19? Now, I find it ironic that Americans anticipate, indeed expect, a flu season every year, yet act surprised when they contract the flu. I can't think of nowhere else on the planet where entire populations of people foster an expectation for illness, like we do here. See, my fear isn't of COVID-19 in its current iteration, but what it could potentially become in some not too distant future if scientists don't take it seriously enough long after the hysteria is gone. One of the things consistently understood about COVID-19 is that it seems to take advantage of weak or compromised immune systems. It's also understood that it can't sustain heat over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It can, however, live on the surface of metal for 12 hours and on the surface of our hands for 5 to 10 minutes. It can remain active in human tissue for 6 to 12 hours. Now, these are some of the things we know. But what we tend to overlook is that many Americans have compromised immunity already. And why is that? Because way too many are diabetic or pre-diabetic or suffering from chronic inflammation, have chronic heart disease or circulatory issues. They breathe shallow, eat too many foods that lack nutrition, don't drink enough water, don't sleep enough, don't rest enough, or are already taking a prescribed medical cocktail. And you couple all that with the mass hysteria cultivated by the media that has greatly increased, indeed induced stress levels and thus cortisol levels, and you have the ingredients of transforming a mildly infectious pandemic into a deadly one that could rival 1918. But I don't believe it will. At least that is my prayer. See, my prayer is that we can learn from the lessons of the past, that collectively we have survived tougher times and have prevailed as a species. If COVID-19 can teach us anything, maybe it is the naked truth, the immutable lesson that we are all interconnected as a human family. Because if we don't learn this lesson, then it won't be a virus that will take us out. It will be our unwillingness to wash our hands of the past, of our own segregated, bigoted thinking with that increased need for social distancing. Or we can instead strengthen the immune system of the human family by no longer compromising it to a greater virus called hate. Love and respect for all is the only known vaccine for that. There's truly nothing new under the sun.